I will call the remote hearing of the Environment and Natural Resources Finance and Policy Committee to order. Today is February 11th, 2021. This meeting is held in accordance with Rule 10.01, which was passed and allows for remote hearings. All remote hearings are recorded and live streamed by House Public Information. The clerk will take the attendance by roll.
So Chair Hanson is present. Wozlowick Amy.
Wozlowick present.
Wozlowick present. Heisman Josh.
Present.
Heisman present. Acom Patty.
Acom present.
Acom present. Ackland Susan.
Ackland present.
Ackland present. Backer Jeff.
I'm Backer present.
Backer present. Becker Finn Jamie.
Becker Finn present.
Becker Finn present. Eklund Rob.
Eklund present.
Eklund present. Fisher Peter.
Fisher present.
Fisher present. Green Steve. Green Steve. Igo Spencer.
I go present.
Igo present. Jordan Sydney.
Jordan present.
Jordan present. Keeler Heather.
Keeler present.
Keeler present. Lee Fu.
Lee present.
Lee present. Lippert Todd.
Lippert present.
Lippert present. Lewick Dale.
Lewick present.
Lewick present. Morrison Kelly.
Morrison present.
Morrison present. Nelson Nathan.
Nelson present.
Nelson present. Tice Tama. Tice Tama. Green Steve. Green Steve. All right, so a quorum is present.
Thank you. Before we move to the minutes, Representative Lewick, did you want to say anything to Vice Chair Wozlowick?
Yes, in fact, I wanted to convey my apology for being more than abrupt and short with you as chair, and so I apologize for that. No excuse for it. I lost my temper. Keep up the good work.
Representative Wozlowick?
Thank you, Representative Lewick, and appreciate the apology and certainly accept that and move forward from here. Thank you.
Thank you. We have the minutes. Representative Wozlowick, have you looked at the minutes?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I would move approval of the minutes.
Representative Wozlowick moves the minutes for February 9th, 2021. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed? The minutes are approved. Members, this morning we have, or this afternoon, it's been a long day, folks. We have the Office of Legislative Auditor Special Review of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, Water Gremlin Company. This will take till about, the presentation will be going till about 1:25, and then there will be a response from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Members, just a little bit on Audit Commission. The Audit Commission can present reports to the Audit Commission. The legislative auditor can go to the Audit Commission or to a committee. Generally, when a report is presented, there's not any public testimony, but there is the opportunity for the agency to provide comments and/or a rebuttal. I will be starting the hearing, and then I have a bill up in a different committee. So Vice Chair Wozlowick will be running the meeting for a portion of it. Mr. Nobles, did you want to say anything before we get started?
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry I was muted. I just want to thank you and your members for holding this hearing. Really appreciate it. We think this is an important issue for your consideration, and I'll turn it over to our Director of Special Reviews, Joel Alter, who did the research and wrote the report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And if you could just state your name for the record.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair. Jim Nobles, Legislative Auditor.
Mr. Alter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And for the record, my name is Joel Alter. I am the Director of Special Reviews for the Office of the Legislative Auditor. And thank you for inviting me to present this report. I think what I'm going to do right away here is share the screen. We're going to do this with some slides today. And so I'm hoping you will have this shortly. There we go. Mr. Chair and Madam Chair, many of you probably recall that in 2019, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency entered into an agreement with the Water Gremlin Company. The agreement resulted in a large fine and multiple requirements for the company to meet. We undertook this report not to determine the culpability of the company in this case. Rather, we looked to see how MPCA regulated the company over the years leading up to the 2019 agreement, and whether there is more MPCA as a regulatory body could have done. Our overall conclusion is that MPCA did not regulate Water Gremlin as effectively as it could have and should have. If MPCA had done a more effective job of issuing permits and enforcing environmental requirements, perhaps MPCA could have identified problems at Water Gremlin sooner and intervened earlier. But I also want to say that we can't be certain that that would have prevented the problems that were ultimately discovered. This report is what our office calls a special review, and let me begin by just saying a few words about what that means. Most of the reports that are produced by our office are either financial audits or program evaluations. Financial audits look at agency compliance with accepted accounting practices. Evaluations look broadly at agency performance or management. And I should mention that we only undertake evaluations at the explicit direction of the Legislative Audit Commission, of which Representative Hansen is a longtime member. But as a watchdog agency for the state, we try to be responsive to concerns that are brought to our attention. And so at our discretion and as resources allow, we occasionally undertake what we call special reviews in response to complaints we receive or legislative requests. Often the focus of special reviews is compliance, whether the legal requirements are being followed by state agencies and state officials. Now, before getting to our findings, I want to provide a little bit of background first on the Water Gremlin Company. The company was started in 1949. It is a manufacturing plant based in White Bear Township. Initially, the company made its name and a big name producing fishing sinkers, including a popular item called the rubber core sinker. Over the years, the company diversified. A large part of the company's business today involves coating and sealing battery terminals. These might be for vehicle batteries or for construction related batteries, but that's done to protect or prevent leaking and corrosion. Until 2019, Water Gremlin used a chemical in its coating processes called trichloroethylene, or TCE. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency says TCE can be carcinogenic to humans by all means of exposure. That's regardless of whether it's inhaled or ingested or whether you get it on your skin for prolonged periods. TCE is one of about 200 chemicals classified by the federal government as a hazardous air pollutant. You also sometimes hear people talk about volatile organic compounds, and TCE is one example of something that is classified as a volatile organic compound. The Minnesota Department of Health does not regulate air pollution, but it has established guidance on what levels of exposure to TCE should be considered safe. And as I think all of you know, in 2020, the legislature passed legislation signed by the governor that will ban most uses of TCE in MPCA permitted facilities starting next year. I'm going to be talking about our findings today in kind of two batches, air quality permitting and enforcement. And this slide that's before you right now, I'm not going to walk through each of these on this slide because I'm actually going to talk about each of them in a little more detail separately, but I just thought I'd give you a little roadmap as to where we're heading today in this discussion, first about air quality permitting. Our first permit-related finding is that MPCA did not issue an initial air quality permit to Water Gremlin in a timely manner. Back in 1990, Congress approved major amendments to the U.S. Clean Air Act. These required each state to implement a permitting program that met federal standards, and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency received interim approval from EPA for its permitting program in the middle of 1995. Right around that time, Water Gremlin submitted its first application for an air quality permit. We couldn't find any record that MPCA responded to that application, even acknowledging its receipt. I should mention too that federal law required MPCA to act on this permit within 3 years of its submission. After hearing nothing from MPCA, Water Gremlin eventually reapplied in 1999, and there were quite a few revisions to the new application compared with the one it had submitted previously. MPCA did respond to that application, and it issued a permit to Water Gremlin in 2000. But between 1995 and 2000, Water Gremlin was essentially unregulated as far as air quality goes, despite the fact that Water Gremlin had disclosed in its 1995 application that it far surpassed the federal threshold for being considered what's called a major source of air pollution. MPCA told us that it gave priority to other types of permits at the time when it was not acting on Water Gremlin's application. Our second finding related to permitting, MPCA approved an amendment to Water Gremlin's air quality permit in 2000, and we concluded that that amendment did not effectively control TCE. So the company had applied for a permit amendment in 2001, and you might be saying to yourself, well, gee, didn't they just get a permit in 2000? Why are they applying for a permit amendment already in 2001? Well, the fact is that the equipment the company installed in 2000 to control pollution did not work. And so, and I should say another word about that, the equipment they installed was what was called an oxidizer. What it did, and this is completely appropriate and legitimate, it burned the TCE as a way of controlling the emissions. The new equipment that the company installed in early 2002 was different. Rather than burning TCE, it was going to recapture the TCE. And in fact, the company had disclosed to MPCA that it intended to then reuse the TCE again. But MPCA kept very similar language in the 2002 amended permit compared with what existed previously. The amended permit kept the same limit on the amount of TCE the company could purchase, and it did not explicitly limit the overall amount of TCE the company could use. That was an important problem, given that the company had shifted, and it was now not only going to be purchasing TCE, but it would be both purchasing and reusing this chemical. Another permitting weakness is that MPCA did not require periodic retesting of Water Gremlin's pollution control equipment after 2002. When the equipment was installed in 2002, the company, as required by MPCA, arranged for a test of the company to see if, in fact, this new equipment was controlling at least 95% of the TCE emissions. And in fact, the test showed that it was. But the 2002 permit amendment, and in fact, a later amendment that was done in 2006, did not require subsequent retesting. Meanwhile, the company had the equipment rebuilt and significantly repaired, both in 2003 and 2005. And so we have to wonder whether the equipment, as it was repaired, was working as well as it was when it was last tested in 2002. What we do know from MPCA's 2019 stipulation agreement is that the equipment did not meet the required level of efficiency for at least a decade prior to that agreement. And we have to think that a retesting requirement in the permit would probably have revealed those problems sometime sooner. Finally, besides the permitting issues that were specific to the Water Gremlin permit, our report says that a couple more general but long-standing permitting problems could have affected MPCA's oversight of Water Gremlin. First, MPCA has talked for more than 30 years about developing state rules to regulate hazardous air pollutants, what are sometimes in Minnesota referred to as air toxics. And I won't get into a lot of details here, but as many of you probably know, there are criteria pollutants, which are the primary thing regulated by the Clean Air Act at the federal level and by state regulations. But then there's this whole category of a large number of air toxics that are not regulated in the same way as the criteria pollutants. And so Minnesota does not have rules for air toxics because nothing has happened in those many years of discussion. As a result, the state provisions for reporting on emissions of air toxics are largely voluntary, and the permit conditions that MPCA writes into permits on air toxics are largely negotiated, determined on a case-by-case basis without the benefit of guidance in state rules. The other longstanding issue is that MPCA has had backlogs in air quality permitting for decades. MPC does set priorities among permits that are consistent with what state law requires, but it never has seemed to be able to get caught up. And there were some people that suggested to us in our discussions that perhaps the pressures that are on the air quality permit writers created by those backlogs could have contributed to hasty or inadequate permit oversight. I will say that MPCA has told us that there has been a doubling of the air quality permit staff in recent years. And so we would have to hope that at least in future years, that backlog can be addressed. But I will say it has existed for as long as I've followed MPCA and for as long as some of the longstanding staff at MPCA can recall. The second area that I want to turn to is our findings related to enforcement. And again, I'm just going to put them up here on the screen again. This is a little bit of a roadmap to what I'm going to talk about individually. And so MPCA not only issues permits, but it then monitors and enforces those permits. The first enforcement related finding, we found that MPCA did not inspect water gremlin as often as it was required to. MPCA did conduct air quality inspections in 2004, 2012, and 2017. But facilities that have the federal classification that water gremlin has are supposed to be inspected no less than every 5 years, and they can be inspected more frequently than that too, certainly. So as you can see, there was an 8-year gap between inspections from 24 to 2012, and that coincided with a period when, according to MPCA, the company was consistently out of compliance. Now, would one more inspection or 2 more inspections have enabled MPCA to detect problems at water gremlin? We don't know that. The 3 inspections that MPCA did between 2004 and 2017 found the company to be largely in compliance. So there is no guarantee that 1 or 2 more inspections would have identified compliance problems, but I think that certainly would have provided yet another opportunity for the eyes at MPCA to perhaps see something that might have triggered questions, raised a red flag, and so I think it was a missed opportunity. We also found that MPCA did not sufficiently review company self-reports on emissions. Both the federal and state governments require companies to submit reports on their actual emissions. According to MPCA, inspectors have looked to see whether companies have in fact submitted the required reports. In other words, they're looking to see that the company is complying with this reporting requirement, but they haven't necessarily looked at the contents of those reports as part of the inspection process. MPCA inspectors told us they were unaware that water gremlin was reusing TCE in its operations. They said that when they went out to do on-site inspections, they couldn't tell from on-site observations that the company was reusing TCE. But we found that the emission inventory reports that water gremlin submitted to the state clearly disclosed, at least in many of the years, that there was TCE being reused by water gremlin. That was right in the reports. And so the fact that the inspectors didn't look at the content of those reports, again, was a missed opportunity to identify a company practice that perhaps they would have said, this doesn't really square with what we're seeing in the permit. This next slide, I think, provides important context, both for what I've just talked about, but also for what I'm going to talk about in a moment. The chart shows, if you look at and I'm going to call them orange bars, those bars are the emissions, the TCE emissions that Water Gremlin initially reported to the federal government over the years. The blue bars show revisions to the state and federal reports that Water Gremlin submitted in 2019. And then toward the bottom of the graph, there's a red line that goes all the way across the bottom. That is the threshold that defines, using federal definitions, what a major source of pollution, in this case TCE, would amount to. What's apparent in this chart is that Water Gremlin, for the entire period of this chart, from 1993 through 2018, was a major source of pollution. And also note that during many of the years after 2000, the company initially substantially underreported its emission levels. And that's for reasons that I don't know what they are, but I think that's important to understand. So while there were years, and many years, when Water Gremlin's permit violations were hidden from view because of underreporting, that was not the case in 2000 to 2002. I'll briefly go back here, and you can see that the yellow lines in 2000 through 2002 are well above the threshold that would have deemed them a major polluter. And in those years, they had publicly disclosed this. It was not a secret. It was in the federal reports. In 2001, around this time, MPCA issued what's called a schedule of compliance. That's an enforceable document to get the company to install new pollution control equipment. And that was good. I think it was important to get the company to move to do just that. But I would also note that MPCA never did penalize the company for its excess emissions. I don't know for sure, based on the documents that I saw, whether MPCA even was aware, based on the federal reports, that the company had been violating its permit. But I think as we look back now on a company that violated its permit for many years running, I think as we look back at that period when the company had, in fact, in its own self-disclosures, demonstrated that it was violating its permit terms, it certainly would have been possible for MPCA to send a stronger message to the company at that time. Finally, I'm going to shift gears just a little bit here to our last enforcement finding, but this doesn't relate to air quality, it relates to hazardous waste. Our report says that the Water Gremlin case illustrates a lack of clarity in enforcement in hazardous waste regulations. In outstate Minnesota, outside of the 7-county Twin Cities area, in those 80 counties, MPCA is fully responsible for enforcing state hazardous waste regulations. But in the Twin Cities area, in those 7 counties, MPCA and the counties share enforcement duties. Ramsey County did all of the hazardous waste inspections of Water Gremlin until 2019. But when MPCA inspected the company in 2019, it cited the company for practices that the county had not cited the company for. And so what you had were different interpretations of the same regulations. I should add that in one county, Hennepin, MPCA has entered into a joint powers agreement that spells out the respective state and county duties more explicitly. And MPCA told us that at least in some of the other counties in the metro area, there has been resistance to entering into such agreements. Our report provides several recommendations, and I should add, MPCA has been in the process of writing, developing a new air quality permit for Water Gremlin. Our recommendations generally focus on the enforcement side of things, and some of these practically go without saying. The first is simply MPCA should comply with federal inspection requirements and what it has agreed to. In addition, MPCA should be making full use for compliance purposes of information in the state and federal emissions inventories. At least in some cases, those might provide clues to non-compliance. We think MPCA should take additional steps to ensure that it has a common understanding with counties in the metro area of hazardous waste regulatory requirements, whether that happens through training, communications, or other approaches. And in addition, we think the legislature should perhaps consider whether there's a need, kind of building off of that third recommendation, to consider another recommendation in statute. It certainly would be possible for the legislature to mandate that MPCA enter into joint powers agreements with each of the counties in the metro area. I don't think I would want to paint that as being a panacea. There obviously has to be a working relationship between MPCA and the counties that allows it to get to a common understanding. But I also think the joint powers agreements could be helpful in that regard. So to summarize, I think it's important to remind ourselves that Water Gremlin, this company, substantially underreported its emissions for many years. That is the heart of the compliance problem that led to all of this. And its non-compliance was not always apparent in public records. But we think that prior to 2019, MPCA could also have been a better regulator. MPCA missed opportunities to intervene more effectively with the company. And so just as the company has to be accountable for its violations, MPCA should be accountable for its performance in issuing the permits and in enforcing environmental requirements. And that's what this report is really all about, is taking a look back and offering commentary on MPCA's performance. So, Madam Chair, I think I will stop there and see whether you want questions or whether you want to go to MPCA.
Thank you, Mr. Alter. I think we'll take the response from the MPCA first. I know Commissioner Bishop is here with some other folks, and then we'll take questions after the response. Commissioner Bishop.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I am Laura Bishop, the Commissioner of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I want to thank the chair specifically, as well as Representative Becker-Finn, Representative Fisher, and members of the Senate that represent this area of White Bear. We have worked very closely with all of you since first discovering this issue, and we appreciate your leadership and input as we continue to move forward. I'd also be remiss if I did not mention the Neighborhood of Concerned Citizens group of White Bear, whom the agency has worked with to hold public meetings, as well as participate in regular discussions and reviews on ways in which we can continue to hold the company accountable and improve as an agency on our enforcement and compliance efforts. I appreciate the Office of Legislative Auditors' thorough 25-year review of the agency's permitting and compliance and enforcement programs with respect to Water Gremlin, and I appreciate the time spent with Mr. Alter on this review. He's been thorough, fair, and has recognized both what could have been done better by the agency and the company. Over the past several years, we know that after 2002, and the legislative auditor has recognized in his report as well that there have been improvements to our processes that would have reduced the chance of something like this happening again. Water Gremlin's egregious violations were brought to my attention within my first few days as MPCA commissioner, and its operations and compliance remain a significant focus to the agency today. It must be noted that all regulated parties are required under federal and state law to submit accurate and timely information to regulatory agencies. Submitting misleading or false information is a serious violation and subject to enhanced enforcement, such as increased penalties and stringent corrective actions. Regulated parties that violate these fundamental requirements must be held accountable. And that is why MPCA took legal enforcement action against Water Gremlin and continues to hold the company accountable. Holding Water Gremlin accountable remains a priority for us. We are also holding ourselves accountable and have welcomed this review, as I've mentioned. Some areas where the MPCA has made improvements include developing comprehensive administrative and technical checklists that clearly identify required information in permit applications and what an engineer needs to consider when writing an air permit. Increased consistency in our permits by developing a library of permitting templates and requirements that are continuously refined and reviewed by the permitting program. We've added new engineering staff that undergo rigorous training and mentoring, and all staff participate in regularly scheduled meetings to discuss and troubleshoot permitting issues and concerns, including meetings specifically focused on permit issuance improvements. There's enhancements to our peer review process following established protocols and checklists to strengthen permitting processes, improving consistency and reliability. And then our compliance and enforcement inspectors review permits to ensure that permit conditions are clear and enforceable. The MPCA believes that both the review and permitting processes in place would have helped to identify the fact that Water Gremlin planned to reuse PCE in its operations as part of that 2002 permit amendment. In addition, MPCA has been working to develop an emissions inventory database tool since January 2020 that will identify potential discrepancies between reported emissions and permitted limits. The review of emissions inventory reports by inspectors will be a tool that should help identify potential issues. But a review of an emissions report may not be sufficient to uncover all of the areas of non-compliance, especially if the report is based on incorrect data provided by the facility, and as in this case, it was Water Gremlin. And while the air permitting staff has increased over the past 20 years, it is not adequate in addressing what is needed to fully handle our backlog of permitting. We have 38 air permitting staff and over 2,000 air permits. We prioritize our permits based on the legislative directive that priority is placed on new construction and major expansion permits versus simple renewals with no changes. Lastly, the OLA's findings reinforce our specific funding requests included in the governor's budget. We have asked for funding for new air monitoring equipment, which is essential to ensuring compliance and providing a deterrent to violators. And this recommendation also contains additional compliance and enforcement staff that will allow for more timely inspections and compliance assistance for permitted facilities. Yet I say this, and it doesn't change the outcome of this non-compliance. Years of pollution exposure for the communities surrounding Water Gremlin. Communities are at the heart of our enforcement decisions, as well as in our efforts to consider any new permits and permit modifications for Water Gremlin, and that will continue. The safety of our communities guides our work every day in our mission to protect and improve the environment and human health, and we want our regulated parties to be successful and accountable. While enforcement is never the goal of the agency, it is necessary when regulated parties violate their permits and put the community in danger. And that is what we did in this case in 2019 and when we discovered this. We held Water Gremlin accountable and issued one of the largest fines for an air permit violation that we have ever issued as an agency. Our much preferred route is that these are discovered early by either self-reporting by the regulated party or through our routine inspection or review of the permits. As regulators, we are accountable. Moving forward, we are committed to listening and learning and applying the OLA's report to help further our continuous improvement efforts. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I see that Representative Hansen is back. Do you want to take over as chair at this point?
I think you're doing great. You can keep going.
All right, I see a couple of member questions. I just want to say a little bit on this before we take member questions, just so folks have an idea of sort of what has happened to community members in the wake of these discoveries. One of the people who has been very involved in the conversations around this has had multiple issues with various rare forms of cancer over several years, and there's been other reports of similar things in the affected area where where the pollution impacted folks. So just want to, I think we all are aware of that, but just want to say that, this isn't just the pollution went in the air and it's bad for the environment. This is also having impacts on human health, and we want to acknowledge that and make sure folks are aware of that. So I will move to member questions now. I saw Representative Lee's hand up.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Auditor Nobles and Commissioner for being here, and appreciate Commissioner Bishop, you and Governor Waz and the administration really stepping in right away when you found out about this issue. But I think that for the residents that I represent in my district over in North Minneapolis, this is not something new that we see, and on a daily basis, with some of the heavy industry that it's on the Mississippi River, and that's why we have introduced some legislation that we will be hearing next week. And so, Auditor Nobles, I wanted to see if when you were looking at this, where you the report said that from 1995 to 2000, Water Gremlin went unregulated because the agency was looking at other priority permits. Can you tell us to what extent were there other maybe a similar major source polluters that were not covered or were not taken a look at because of the agency prioritizing something else?
Mr. Alter.
Madam Chair and Representative Lee, we only looked in this review at Water Gremlin. What the MPCA staff told us is that back around the mid-90s, the focus of their permitting activities, or I should say at least the priority of their permitting activities, were some of the large emitters like refineries, that scale of facility. But I would also say, looking at what we say in our report back in 1995, when Water Gremlin submitted its initial permit application, it was disclosing to MPCA at that time that it was emitting many times the major threshold that is that federal threshold referred to earlier of TCE. And so there can certainly be an argument made that Water Gremlin itself was a big emitter, that it should have been a priority. And, we can't go back and recreate exactly what choices MPCA was making at that time. But we can say that in this case, they missed a big one. They had an opportunity with an application in hand where they could have given some priority to that, and they didn't. To your question, were there other significant emitters that did not get the attention of MPCA? There were certainly other entities that were seeking permits that didn't get them in that period because MPCA was focused on other facilities. And MPCA would tell you, and I think we have a reference in our report to a federal report, other states were scrambling, having some struggles to try to, after the federal government mandated this permitting program in every state had to come up with something. And so most states weren't getting everything done within 3 years, which is what the federal expectation was. But again, I would say, yes, in the case of Water Gremlin, there were some important facilities that an argument could be made should have been moved higher onto the list, but which weren't.
Last follow-up, Madam Chair.
Lee, yep, go ahead.
So, Mr. Auditor or Auditor Nobles, can you speak to why there wasn't, or even before I ask my questions, when we found out that the MPCA, that they did not comply with their inspection requirements, what happens then? If they're not complying with their own requirement, who is protecting the public now? And why did you not have recommendations on what can we do to address this issues to ensure that the NPCA going forward is complying with their inspection requirement?
Mr. Alter?
Madam Chair and Representative Lee. Well, first of all, the MPC is required by the federal government to meet those inspection requirements that I talked about. As you know, in the language of both the federal government and MPCA, those inspection requirements are federally enforceable. So I don't know what the consequences would be, you know, if the MPC doesn't do all of those inspections that it says it's going to do, but it has to answer to the EPA for that. You know, again, I think by our bringing this to public attention, we're trying to hold MPCA's feet to the fire on this as well and say, you know, in this case, you didn't do your job. You were supposed to be out there at least every 5 years and you weren't. And, you know, I don't think MPCA likes having to feel a certain amount of embarrassment by that, but that's the way it is. That's what we found. And, you know, so I should also add, you know, I think MPCA has to keep track of which facilities are in which category. And when we initially asked MPCA, we said, you know, this inspection wasn't done for 8 years. Isn't that a problem given what the federal standards are? And the initial response we got from MPCA was that they were not on any specific inspection schedule. And we took a look at that again and we said, no, I think they are. I think given their, and without getting into the jargon, but you look at a company's what's called potential to emit and how close that is to that major threshold that I talked about. And Water Gremlin was clearly in that category that should be getting 5-year inspections. And when we brought that to their attention, they said, you're right. And so, I mean, there can be misunderstandings, mistakes that happen within agencies. I don't know exactly why that lapse happened in this case, but I think we're saying you need to do a better job going forward.
I just want to ask a quick follow-up to Representative Lee's question. Can someone from the MPCA maybe, I don't know if you guys can talk about this, but how does the EPA, they have requirements for these 5-year inspections. How do they know that state agencies are actually doing them? What's their check on that? I guess I would ask.
Madam Chair, I would turn this over to Doug Wetstein, who manages our industrial program and that agreement with the EPA.
Mr. Wetstein?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Doug Wetstein, I'm the Industrial Division Director at the MPCA. The Federal Clean Air Act does not specify how often inspections of permitted facilities must occur or the nature of those inspections. However, over time, the US EPA has issued guidance and requirements to state and local agencies on inspection frequencies. That said, we do have a commitment with the US EPA where we have certain facilities that we have to inspect on a basis, annual basis, or every 3-year basis that we negotiate with them. But one of the things I'd like to point out that's different today with regard to compliance enforcement is we now have a system, electronic system database, if you will, called Tempo, which all of our inspectors can use to prioritize facilities to inspect. It's based on their compliance history, location within an environmental justice area of concern. It incorporates modeling that might indicate health risks or actual emissions that are at or above 80% of a permitted limit. These are all things that are relatively new in the last few years that have changed the way in which MPCA selects facilities to inspect and kind of putting a focus on the ones that need the attention.
Thank you, Mr. Wetstein. I see Representative Keeler, and then we'll go to Representative Jordan. Representative Keeler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have to admit this is extremely unsettling for me as I learn more and more about this. We're working towards really moving towards a state that is environmentally kind. And I think that a lot of things were missed here. One of the things that I think my question is actually going to go to Commissioner Bishop about the fees and fines that you talked about. You said that when they're regulated parties are obligated to submit accurate reports, timely and not misleading. We know that this was not timely and extremely misleading. And you said that you gave them a fine. Was it easy for them to pay that fine? Has that fine been paid? And then I have a follow-up question to that.
Commissioner Bishop.
Madam Chair and Representative Keeler, I would agree with you that this is disturbing. And the fine was one of the largest. I can't say that it was easy if it was easy or not for them to pay. Those fines are based on a formula of environmental harm as well as their economic viability. Those are part of a stipulation agreement, and the economic what they derived economically during that time of violation. That's why the fine was as large as it was. It was $5.4 million with another community SEPs, they call them, supplemental environmental projects that went along with this, as well as really extensive air monitoring that went onto their facility that they had to pay for and report. That was in addition to what they'd done wrong. It was a very large fine. I can't tell you what their financial situation was to pay for it, but I can tell you that there was a lot of back and forth on the and concerns that they had with the amount of the fine that we fine them.
Madam Chair.
Representative Keeler.
So the follow-up is, if we want to move towards this better space, just giving fines to organizations and companies that can continue to pay the fine sometimes continues to create the problem. So I mean, at what point are they so out of range that it affects their permits and their ability to even do the work anymore? I mean, if we keep paying the fines to keep doing the job that's creating toxic air, at what point do we just shut that down? And then in the formula that you were talking about, is there a community health impact study that's a part of that? So it's more than just looking at the air. Chair Wozlowick talked about that, the health impact that it also has on the community. Is that part of the formula with the fines and the outcome?
Commissioner Bishop.
Madam Chair and Representative Keeler, so you're right on when we acted very swiftly and decisively to hold them accountable. It was not easy to come up with just a fine. We shut them down, and that's what we prevented them from using this chemical TCE. They could not operate their whole coating line until significant time passed that we were assured that they could substitute with a new chemical to be able to, that they could use safely to restart their operation. So it wasn't just a fine, it was a shutdown. And that shutdown immediately happened when we discovered this, because to get to a settlement and a stipulation agreement does take time. So they were shut down during that entire time and for several months after that, until they could transition to a new product that was less toxic. So that was an important part of the working on this. I do not think, and I came from private industry myself into this role, and you do not want a fine, and you do not, these companies do not want a fine, and they do not want to just pay a fine and move on. I really believe that. Most of our regulated parties are doing the right thing and complying with their permits. This was egregious, and that is why we held them to the extent that we did on their accountability, as well as their shutdown of their operation until we could be assured that they would be operating effectively and with a less toxic chemical. In addition, we're going through a whole permit review right now, and they will have to operate under a new permit. And we're working with community input on those efforts as we look at this new permit before they could operate. So that's also part of this. As far as your question, sorry, as far as your question on community health, that was also just, it is something that's considered. It was part of the community environmental supplemental agreement and SEP program, environmental programs, and part of what we look at overall. But our Department of Health really looks at, that overall community health, as well as going in to understand the actual impacts to the community as a whole.
Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to all the presenters here today. This has been very eye-opening, for better, for worse. But I have a question just generally, so when we talk a lot about inspections. What is that? So someone goes to the MPCA, the MPCA goes to Water Gremlins and does an inspection. What does that entail? What does that look like?
Commissioner Bishop.
Madam Chair, I would like to have Doug Wetstein of our Industrial Division really walk through that, the day-to-day on this.
Mr. Wetstein.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, individual inspectors are assigned facilities, whether it's an air inspector or a hazardous waste inspector. They would familiarize themselves with what we have in our files, the permit, any other available information. Maybe talk to the permit engineers and others that have some information or knowledge of the facility. They could be an announced or an unannounced inspection. Typically, they're announced just so that there's someone there that can escort them and show them around. But they review permit conditions. They look to see if the equipment is being operated and maintained properly. They check record keeping, operation and maintenance logs. Basically, it's eyes and ears. They're looking, noting what they see, documenting what they see, and write up a report. If they've noted something, they'll discuss that with their supervisor and other inspectors, and it may be escalated from there. But typically, that's how an inspection is done, whether it's air or hazardous waste. Inspectors are typically entry-level employees, where they start their environmental careers. So there's a lot of training that takes place, mentoring. They may have to go out with senior people for a while before they're allowed to sort of go their own way. But I think that is pretty much what you were asking.
Representative Jordan, any follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Well, first of all, I would love to shadow one of those inspections if that's something that's possible when we're home vaccinated. But if that's something that you could offer in the future, that's something I'm certainly interested in. I think the biggest crux of the question is I think Representative, we share, our districts are right next to each other, and we do share quite a bit in a huge industrial corridor on the Mississippi River. And I think what we're both wondering is, was Water Gremlin an anomaly, or is this an indication of a broader issue across the state? And do you have the resources you need to prevent the next Water Gremlin from happening?
I don't know who wants to take that one on.
Yeah. Madam Chair, I'm happy to take that. We do believe that to the extent of the pollution that was happening, that this was an anomaly. And this was a miss in 2002 in this permit. And what we've seen since, and I think I've reiterated some of the improvements that have been made, the agency does have a really thorough process that's in place. In addition, the last year in the legislature and over these past 2 years, we've been working to phase out TCE as a state, and thanks to the work of the legislature as well, and then our work, directly with companies. So this isn't the only hazardous air pollutant or hazardous pollutant, but it's definitely minimizing that type of risk for the future. So I think that, anything that is a carcinogen like this, we have to be extra vigilant. And I did ask the team, again, I started in 2019 and this review really looks at prior to that. But I asked the team, I need to know all of these major, especially when it's something like TCA or carcinogen that's going into our air or water, who's using these, and are we thorough and are we doing this right? As far as the funds and personnel, we do not have enough people, and we are prioritizing, and I've moved people into different roles for this. We have really worked at prioritizing the industrial division under Doug Wetstein, our new director, in the past year. And we have a new air permit manager who is really overseeing the day-to-day and working on this. But, when we have 2,000 permits and 38 personnel that review air permits and 9 that concentrate on compliance and enforcement in the industrial division, that's not adequate for the amount of regulated parties that we have in the state, which is about 8,000 permits that we have at any time. So we have seen historically the agency has been depleted, and that's part of why we've asked for the budget. And again, it's a modest budget request of two people and then some added air equipment, but it's not a lot that we have. And it's part of why we do partner with our counties on inspections and enforcement, and Mr. Alter brought that up as well. We do have a pretty extensive memorandum of understanding and delegation of authority in place with our counties, but one that's specifically in place with Hennepin County that could be used as a model for our other counties as well. When we talk about kind of that memorandum or of shared responsibilities and understandings, and want to continue to work on those and develop those.
Representative Jordan, any follow-up?
No, Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for your leadership on this.
We'll go to Representative Fisher next, and then Representative Morrison.
Thank you, Chair Waslick. First of all, can you folks hear me okay? I've been going from Zoom call to Zoom call here, or a Zoom meeting here. I just want to make sure I'm coming across well. Thank you. This is to the part of the report I'm going to that starts on page 10, 11, and 12 that's hitting on the lead issue. I'm really concerned about some of the things that were coming up in there. First of all, I do recall that the Ramsey County had done some early issues around here, started finding issues around 2017, 2018 with elevated lead levels in the blood of children there. And from what I understand, that out of the children of employees they tested, 25% of those they tested showed some level of lead poisoning in their system that was conclusively figured to be coming directly from water gremlin here. And as I was reading some of the reports here, first of all, we know that there's no safe level of lead for children at all in the development ages. As I was looking at page 12 of the report, it was reporting that when the Ramsey County was doing some of their work, they were finding readings of lead on the floors of the cars at 200 times the residential floor standard, nearly 40 times the residential windowsill standard. These are lead issues that had gone from the plant into the cars and eventually into people's homes. And it feels like we've got some major disconnects that are happening that, you can identify that early warning, we've got problems with the company going back to 2018. And it was just in the past year that we were able to take some legal action against them. And it feels like we've got some additional holes in the system here, is that we've got a very hazardous chemical that when it infects a child and they are poisoned, that ends up costing society $100,000 a year for the rest of that person's life. So we've got, 25% of their kids that were tested had some level of lead poisoning. So we're talking about millions of dollars of impacts to our society for years to come. And it feels like there was very little that the county seemed to do what they could, but it seemed like they didn't have actions. It seemed like this should have been something that the MPCA should have been aware of, but it seems like the way it was set up is there was no way for these things to connect back and forth. That could have been an early lead and given us early warning. This is a company with more severe problems out there. I mean, this isn't just TC, this is other hazardous chemicals. And you take a look at the work that was being done, that the homes had to be cleaned up. It is out in the community. If these are rental properties, the rental properties were contaminated. How does an agency get its hands around it? Because I'm taking a look at Department of Health. I'm imagining Dolly should have been doing something because these are workers' safety. It feels like we've got some larger holes that are out there. And I'm wondering, first of all, from the auditor's point of view, as they were taking a look at things, I haven't been able to get back to the chapters in the back, but I didn't see anything saying that. Are there gaps between the agencies that could have helped address this sooner, or at least brought agencies together in a more jointful way, and versus such what I felt was a very fragmented approach? And what are things that the agencies are looking at to try to avoid these kind of problems in the future? Because if it happened at Water Gremlin, where is it happening elsewhere in our state right now? I feel that what I'm seeing right here, this could be happening elsewhere, and there's not a coordinated way to prevent it and to tackle it.
Madam Chair, I think I can answer that. And then I think we have Jim Kelly from the Department of Health that can answer that. Representative Fisher, thank you for raising this. The lead levels in children of Water Gremlin employees is absolutely disheartening and heartbreaking and shouldn't have happened. I can tell you that when we discovered that from the public health records from Ramsey County, it was when in our administration where we pulled the agencies together. We don't want to find it after. And that was something that was discovered through the public health systems through Ramsey County, but then through the records in the database through Department of Health. I think that Jim Kelly would be the best person to talk about this, but what I can say is we pulled together Dolly, MDH, and us to really look at the holistic approach of what needed to be done. And as you know, the Attorney General engaged and helped to shut that down. We're still going through a review, and MPCA's role is, the housekeeping of within hazardous waste and looking at, how lead is both stored and used, but we do have differing areas of responsibility with OSHA, Dolly, the OSHA arm, and Department of Health. So I think Department of Health should answer a little bit on this.
Yeah, Mr. Kelly, if you want to identify yourself for the record and then help with that question.
Certainly, Madam Chair. My name is Jim Kelly. I'm a manager in the Environmental Health Division at the Minnesota Department of Health. And I can echo what Commissioner Bishop said about these types of situations. I think we've learned that agencies need to work together when it comes to these kinds of facilities. And yes, there were differing jurisdictions, so to speak, in terms of addressing lead and the take-home lead issue, which we're still in court essentially over with the company. The Department of Labor and Industry and the Department of Health are still in the process of settling that to kind of resolve those matters. We've definitely increased our communications amongst the agencies as a result of these kinds of activities. We have more regular meetings to discuss topics and industries, in particular issues that are cross-cutting between the agencies, just so we can keep things aligned a little bit more closely when it comes to these types of facilities that really do fall into a number of different jurisdictions between the state agencies. So I think if there's anything we've learned from this situation is that, you know, when one of our agencies runs across a facility that may be having some issues that cross over into other agencies' work, that we need to be, you know, we need to inform each other and work closely together. And that's what's happened since the water gremlin situation first started. So thank you.
Representative Fisher, did you have a follow-up?
Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Wozlik. The follow-up I have is, are there any rules or statutes out there that complicates it? Are there things that make it difficult for sharing between the agencies that we need to be addressing to allow sharing of information in these processes to go much easier?
Commissioner Bishop, or not sure who wants to take that.
Representative Wozlik, I think that I would defer to Jim Kelly on that, especially the sharing between the county and state data with regard to blood levels and other pieces.
Mr. Kelly.
Madam Chair, Representative, not that I'm immediately aware of that are there statutes that inhibit us. In fact, there are, in enforcement situations, it's specifically written into statutes where if they're one agency that's not necessarily the public health agency, such as MDH, has information that has a direct bearing on the health of workers or the community, they are able to share that information with the department under confidentiality arrangements. Typically, we will certainly consider that question, whether there's anything that represents an actual barrier. But typically we're able to share information, especially in situations where the public's health could be at risk.
All right. I'm gonna go to Representative Morrison first, and then we'll go to Representative Heitzman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Nobles and Mr. Alter, for the review and the presentation of it. And thank you, Commissioner, for stepping up to serve our state. You inherited a tough situation, obviously, with water gremlin, and I appreciate your transparency and your efforts to rectify it. I have a couple of questions just so I can better understand kind of the workings of MPCA and the backlog and all of that. You referenced the backlog, and I think you even mentioned a specific number. You know, you can only do what you can do, and if you don't have the resources to do the job, it makes it nearly impossible. I'm wondering if you can share with us exactly how big the backlog is and how many permits does PCA handle a year, for example?
Commissioner Bishop.
Madam Chair and Representative Morrison, I've asked my staff exactly that. You know, there's about, like I said, just for air, for example, and of course the lead falls under hazardous waste, but on air, we have 2,000 air permits. Of those right now, the major permits and the Title V permits, there's about 157 of those permits, 126 of which are expired right now. So prioritizing, again, we prioritize based on the legislative directive, which is as we consider new permits, we're looking at new constructions, those that are focused on growth, again, per the directive that is in statute, and versus our simple renewals. However, having said that, simple renewal, those companies are being held accountable under their existing permit, but the renewals allow for us to review if those permits are adequate, if there's added things and amendments that need to be made to those permits, and what we need to do. But yes, so that's just on the permitting. We do have timelines under directives too by the legislature that which are goals of what we are to meet. And while we tend to be on track with a number of the percentage of permits that we are reviewing and considering, I would say that these larger ones are a problem with our backlog, and more staff would certainly help on this.
Representative Morrison, follow-up
Thank
questions?
you. Thank you, Madam Chair. It strikes me that we have the legislative directive backward, that we should be sure that we are maintaining current permits to appropriate standard before we move on to bigger projects that potentially increase pollution. That might seems like that's something that we should be looking at. Another question I had is, just looking at that time period where we are reviewing the water gremlin situation, do you think it would be valuable to do a review of the permits that were issued during that time period? I know that Representative Jordan kind of brought this up, but it does leave one wondering, can we trust the permitting from that period of time?
Just want to give folks a heads up. We are going to stick with this for the rest of the hearing time today instead of taking up the bill that we were going to, because folks continue to have lots of questions. So Commissioner Bishop, go ahead.
Yeah, Madam Chair and Representative Morrison, I think one of the pieces that we've talked about is that we are taking these recommendations to heart, and we will be doing those types of reviews. A lot of those have been underway before this finding in the report, but certainly it's something that we will be reviewing. And I can tell you that, different commissioners come in and there's different priorities at different times. And so we want to make certain that, the reviews that we're doing as well are consistent with my priorities as well as the governor's priorities. And I think you've seen that in our budget and the work that we're doing. We are focusing on environmental justice. We are focusing on hazardous pollutants and wanting to really acknowledge that this is something that the agency and the public has determined is a focus that is needed and will continue.
Representative Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Bishop, and thank you for repeating what the mission of the PCA should be. I appreciate your work.
Representative Heinzman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And, Commissioner Bishop, I'm going to start out by thanking you for being here. That's a tough job today, and I appreciate that you're here to answer some questions. Unlike the last questions, I'm probably going to be a little bit more direct. And specifically to a comment, I think if I heard you incorrectly, you can correct me, but when you're saying that the governor's budget and the request for FTEs in this subject area is somehow a response to a problem that you identified early on, I'm struggling because I'm only seeing FTEs numbering in 3 in the environmental justice area. If we know that this is a problem, and I think earlier in the OLA's testimony, I saw that we have 38 total FTEs working on a backlog of air quality permits, which is going back, it sounds like, to 1995 and through today's date. Why are we only looking for 3 FTEs in this subject area? And in addition to that, I'm going to make a comment. It does feel like, and as I'm getting text messages during all of this and hearing from the OLA and hearing from MPCA today, it does feel like MPCA has its priorities in a number of subject areas somewhat confused. So, I mean, I don't know what it takes to do the work that you do, so I'm happy to stand corrected, but it does look from the outside like we have made huge steps to pursue things like California's car standards here in Minnesota. That takes FTEs. We've done a lot of things in a lot of subject areas, while we have persistent air quality permit backlogs. So I'm struggling to feel, congratulatory as we've seen some of the comments being made earlier, that somehow things are looking good. But even under your leadership, Commissioner Bishop, this has been a persistent problem. And even in your request, as I mentioned at the beginning, it doesn't appear that this is being taken seriously. And I apologize for being direct, but those are some of the things that I'm hearing from people. And I hope that you can explain why this hasn't been resolved, even under your leadership.
Madam Chair, Representative Heitzman, I would only expect that you would be direct with me, so thank you for that. I will say that the priorities of the agency have been pretty clear under my leadership, and I've made that clear to our regulated parties as well, that I assume are the ones that are texting you at the moment. The priorities of the administration and Governor Walz, and the priority that associates with the Clean Cars rulemaking, is we do have as an agency a priority of addressing climate change. We have a priority of addressing environmental justice and community engagement, as well as operational efficiencies. So you're probably hitting on, when you talk about clean cars, that is hitting on the climate areas. When you talk about environmental justice, you're mentioning those 3 FTEs, which also gets to our efficiencies. Those are in our compliance and enforcement areas. Offering compliance assistance mainly is the focus, and working with our regulated parties so that they can engage the communities more readily, especially in those areas where we have environmental injustices and disparities in and health disparities with our communities of color, our low income communities. So those are priorities. Permitting backlog remains a priority for us. It has been improving, and even with, and certainly, you know, there's all different permits, but you know, even with the permitting backlog, we allow, and those regulated parties can still operate under their existing permits. So we have prioritized anyone that's coming in new for a permit. We've prioritized those if they're related to new construction and growth based on what the legislative, you know, directive is. If they're operating under a current program permit that is expired, they're allowed to continue to operate under that. So nobody's at a disadvantage right now and not being able to operate because of a lack of a permit if they have a permit. I think that our priorities will be and are that, you know, when those permits are up for renewal, that we do those in a more timely manner so that they can be looked at more thoroughly, and that we could catch things like what happened here with Water Gremlin.
Representative Heinzman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, and Commissioner, I appreciate your answer. I do still feel like it's somewhat of a dodge. I do feel like the buck does stop with your office, and that there are so many things that we're seeing here today in this report that are really, unfortunately, subject areas that weren't addressed and haven't been addressed. Now, I'm glad we're talking about it today. Maybe this is a starting point, but it doesn't feel like these things were handled like they could have. You know, and I have a question. Maybe if I could get Doug Weston on again, if he could help maybe describe how the AIR program is funded, and, you know, maybe if changes need to be made and we need to be looking at the fees and the schedule of fees there, you know, because I'm really hearing in the OLA report that we just don't have enough people apparently tasked to this job at MPCA. And if Doug could describe that a little better and help me understand, I would appreciate that.
Wetstein.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, funding for air programs comes from a number of sources, but air emission fees via emissions inventory is one. Permit application fees, and there's a schedule for that in state statute. and then grant monies through agreements with the US EPA. So it's a combination of sources. It pays for a variety of activities at the MPCA, permitting. Along with permitting, there's modeling expertise that's needed. There's technical experts, but that's principally where the dollars come from.
Madam Chair.
Heinzman, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. What I'm really driving at, Doug, is I'm wondering if the air program needs more FTEs, what needs to be done to improve that ratio and make sure that MPCA is on top of this issue from start to finish, and we're not just falling back on the statutory cycle that would, or rules that would allow organizations to continue to function on air permits. I understand that tool is there to keep business functioning, but at the same time, if MPCA is doing their job, they'd be there making sure and confirming that the rules are being followed in a timely way. So if we don't have enough people, how do we get more people?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, the MPCA prioritizes our work. We have directives on what we should be spending our time on, and we focus our efforts there. We also try very hard to continuously improve our processes to become more efficient. We have made significant gains in that regard. You know, I think the initiatives that are put forward speak for themselves, but we, you know, we're told by the business sector to get permits out the door, and we do what we can to accommodate that, but it does take time and expertise. Permits have not gotten easier. The technology is more complicated. Modeling is very sophisticated. There's challenges. There's a lot of back and forth between consultants and our staff. And it takes a lot to train a new engineer. And sometimes we get new engineers in and they get hired away from us. That's just and it's slowed down some recently, but it does present itself. So I think in the past we've asked for air permit engineers, but I think we all know where some of that has landed.
Madam Chair.
Heinzman, I have two other folks with questions. Can we have you take that offline with PCA?
I have one follow-up and comment, and I'll be done. Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Bishop, just one final comment and observation. If you want to respond, that would be fine. My understanding is that MPCA sets their own budget in this subject area, and that's allowed by the Clean Air Act. My understanding is that MPCA could have added more people to this subject area to do this work on your own without any legislative approval or any process here at the legislature. If I'm wrong, you can correct me, but that's my understanding. But it seems like MPCA today has been somewhat dodgy on that question as I've pressed the issue. And I appreciate Doug's answers. I feel like he really did a good job laying that out. Thank you for that. But I do think that there's a lot of finger pointing going on, and I'm not trying to here again cause any difficulties, but it does present a lot of questions, and that's part of what we're here for today. So that's where I'm coming from, Commissioner. Thank you.
Commissioner, if you want to respond.
Madam Chair and Representative Heinzman, thank you. We'll follow up on that. I'm not quite sure I understand the finger pointing here. Certainly, we're trying to do a lot, and I think I've outlined the priorities of the agency as well as the priorities of the governor and So that's what we're focused on.
Representative Becker-Finn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess, I mean, I can give a clear answer. We can direct the MPCA to do more of this work, and we can give them more funding to do the work. You know, we as legislators have a responsibility when things like this happen. And I think not just to advocate for our constituents, but also to prevent this kind of thing from happening in the first place. And I did, and sort of to that, you know, most members on this committee didn't serve on this committee in 2017 and 2018, but just 4 years ago, there were efforts to severely underfund the MPCA and to make permitting even more, you know, even easier, even more lax for polluters. And so that's, you know, we all have a responsibility as legislators, and we do need to get our priorities straight. And frankly, you know, my priorities, and I think many of us, our priorities are with the people of Minnesota and not with the polluters. And so frankly, I don't really care if, you know, there's pressure to do things quickly. We need things to be done correctly so that people aren't suffering these things and people are protected. And so you know, what we do here in our roles as legislators really does impact how our agencies can do their work. And the reality is that there was a direct effort to defund the MPCA just a couple of years ago. And so, you know, I think that's really top of mind for me in listening to this discussion today is how can we as legislators push the agencies to remember what the rules are to protect the people of Minnesota and really keep that at the top of our minds. So not a question, just, you know, wanted to weigh in. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Chair Hansen.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. This is a disturbing report. And I think back to, you know, kind of even what we've been hearing in the last few days that we've had a culture of looking at the regulated parties as clients or customers or stakeholders rather than the client being the public. And that's not that's no criticism of you, Commissioner Bishop. It's been going on for 25, 30 years. And now the bill is coming due. And we hear the impact of interest groups saying, well, we can't deal with everything because that's too big. And if we deal with one thing, with one chemical, then you're just picking winners or losers. All the cliches that we've heard over the years. 10 years ago, we had House File number 1. That was such an important factor that we've heard about it for a decade of streamlining and reducing permitting requirements. And speed was the importance. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has very little funding coming from the general fund. It's mainly from the regulated clientele. So there are backlogs, and our state is growing, our businesses are growing, and the needs are growing, and trying to keep it functioning back on a 1990s model isn't working. We've had several bills already on that, and we'll have more because we need to deal with these contaminants that have been lingering for so long. And now as we get better equipment, faster technology, we're finding more consequences. And those consequences may have been missed in the past. So we have a lot of work to do, and it's not going to take 2 years to resolve it. It's going to take a long time because we didn't get into this in just 2 years. It's a challenge. And I want to thank the auditor staff for their work in detailing out a case study of what can go wrong in regulation. This is it, and we've got to do better, and we've got to work together to try to resolve it.
Also want to echo the thanks for the auditor staff for their work on this, and thank you to the MPCA for being here today to help us understand this and answer questions. Chair Hansen, did you have any announcements before we adjourn?
We'll get the schedule out for next week. Thank you, and we'll see you then.
And I do have some follow-up questions that I'm going to send, and I will forward those to the rest of the committee members. I know we've had a text thread going here with some questions, so I will follow up on that. And with that, we are adjourned.